So welcome to our panelists and welcome to our audience wherever in the world you may be. I'm really thrilled to have you all here. I'm Jeffrey Weidlinger. I'm professor of Jewish Studies and History at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, and working on Jewish life in Ukraine and Poland. I have a book coming out in a couple of weeks on the pogroms in the Russian Civil War. So hope you'll get that. But anyway, that's who I am. And really my pleasure to welcome you all here. I know it's difficult to get here for many of you. I think I spent more time dealing with the technical issues of getting on than it would have taken me to actually get to Warsaw if we were in person. But glad that everybody else managed to get on, hopefully without trouble. And hopefully you can hear us all okay. And if you do have troubles hearing any of us during the presentation, please just say so in the chat. You can also feel free to put questions in the chat, and you can put your questions up as we're progressing. And then towards the end of the panel, I'll ask some of the questions that have been put in the chat. So feel free as they occur to you to put your questions in the chat, which I hope you can all figure out how to do. So this panel is entitled Historians of Societies in Turmoil, Cultural Memory, and the Politics of Memory. And we have three very distinguished panelists who will be giving presentations, about 20 minutes each. And then I'll offer a few comments and open things up and navigate with some questions from the chat. So our first presenter is Omer Bartov. Professor Bartov is the John P. Birkeloon Distinguished Professor of European History at Brown University. Born in Israel and educated at Tel Aviv University and Oxford, he is the author of 8 books. His recent publications include Erased Vanishing Traces of Jewish Galicia in Present-Day Ukraine and Anatomy of Genocide, The Life and Death of a Town Called Buchach, which you may even see in my background. I think it's on my shelf directly behind me, for which he received the National Jewish Book Award and the Yad Vashem International Book Prize for Holocaust Research. The book has also been translated into several languages and is really a remarkable study of the town of Buchach and the violence that beset the town of Buchach. His new book, Tales from the Borderlands, Making and Unmaking the Galician Past, is forthcoming in 2022. We're all looking forward to seeing that. And I'll turn things over to Professor Bartov.
Thank you very much, Jeff. Thanks for this kind introduction. Also, thanks to anyone who is watching us. I have no idea who we are talking to right now, but I hope apart from my distinguished co-panelists, there are some people who have managed to connect to this site. I will try to speak in the next 20 minutes about a rather complex issue. So I hope that you will all be able to make some sense of what I'm talking about, and I'm looking forward to a good discussion. My paper is called Criminalizing Denial as a Form of Erasure, the Polish-Ukrainian-Israeli Triangle. The enactment of laws criminalizing or penalizing certain versions of the past has become an increasingly prominent feature of the past few decades. This predilection is often related to differing interpretations of the events of World War II and its immediate origins and aftermath. Such interpretations, in turn, are usually related to the roles played in the war by different groups. They also reflect an ongoing tension between a desire to expose the obfuscations and denials of past wrongs and an urge to reassert national honor and dignity, even at the price of suppressing or outlawing historical facts that threaten to undermine the favored perception of that particular nation's history. What interests me in this paper is the interdependence of recognition and criminalization of several distinct national discourses. For instance, in 2006, Ukrainian President Viktor Yushchenko proposed a law that recognized the Holodomor, the Stalinist state-directed famine in Ukraine, as genocide and introduced penalties to its denial. While the parliament refused to adopt concrete penalties for denial, it declared that, quote, the Holodomor in Ukraine is an act of genocide of the Ukrainian people, and that its public denial shall be recognized as desecration of the memory of millions of victims, as well as disparagement of the Ukrainian people, and shall be unlawful. The following year, Yushchenko traveled to Israel, visited the Holocaust Memorial at Yad Vashem and the Western Wall, and declared that his trip was intended to express identification with the Jewish people and its heritage. In his speech to the Israeli parliament, Yushchenko condemned anti-Semitism, but made no apology for the role of Ukrainians in the Holocaust. Ultimately, just as Ukraine did not formally assume any responsibility for collaboration in the Holocaust, Israel did not formally recognize the Holodomor as genocide, which was clearly the intention of that trip. For Israel, such recognition would put the Holodomor perilously close to the Holocaust. Yet for Israel, the Holocaust is its cardinal raison d'etre, and its insistence on the uniqueness of the Shoah puts it on a higher moral plane than those who might reject its existence or criticize its policies. This is why for Ukraine, recognition of the Holodomor as genocide by Israel is of greater importance than by any other state, not least considering Ukraine's checkered history vis-a-vis its Jewish inhabitants dating back to 1648. And of course, Jeff is just about to publish a book on what happened there in 1919 in the wake of World War I. Collective Jewish memory has a great deal to do with this as well. For many Jewish survivors stemming from Ukraine, the Ukrainians were, quote, worse than the Germans. The sense of bitterness over betrayal by neighbors, colleagues, and friends is palpable even decades after the event. Ukraine's post-communist veneration of its freedom fighters further complicates matters, since it entails the denial or suppression of their collaboration with the Germans in the mass murder of the Jews, and their entirely independent campaign of ethnic cleansing of the Polish population in Volhynia and Galicia. Enter Poland and its own claims of being the Christ of nations. For Poland, the Jewish-Israeli claim of unique victimhood stands not only in competition to its self-perception, but also undermines Poland's victim status by suggesting Polish complicity in the Holocaust. It also threatens to diminish its claim to having been subjected to genocide by Ukrainian nationalists in Eastern Poland. Poland's memory laws have therefore attempted to confront the conundrum of pre-1989 communist obfuscation, competition of victimhood with the Jews, rejection of any hints of complicity in the Holocaust, and a response to Ukrainian nationalist glorification of its World War II liberation fighters. In 1998, Poland legislated the first memory law in Eastern Europe, stipulating that anyone who denies the, quote, crimes perpetrated against persons of Polish nationality and Polish citizens of other ethnicity and nationality between September 1st, 1939 and December 31st, 1989, including, quote, Nazi crimes, communist crimes, and other crimes against peace, crimes against humanity, or war crimes shall be subject to a fine or penalty of deprivation of liberty of up to 3 years. As noted by others, this avoidance of direct mention of Jews adopted the Soviet habit of subsuming the Holocaust under the general category of crimes against the Polish nation. In 2018, the Polish parliament amended the Act of 1998, adding that anyone who, quote, claims that the Polish nation or the Republic of Poland is responsible or co-responsible for Nazi crimes committed by the Third Reich shall be liable to a fine or imprisonment of up to 3 years. Thus, not only was denial of Nazi and Soviet crimes against the Polish nation criminalized, but also any assertion of Polish complicity. The timeline of crimes against the Polish nation and the list of perpetrators was also expanded to include, quote, crimes committed by Ukrainian nationalists and members of Ukrainian units collaborating with the Third Reich between 1917 and 1990. So this went back all the way to 1917. All this was done, as the legislator noted, with a view to, quote, protecting the reputation of the Republic of Poland and the Polish nation. And that, of course, was in view, among other things, of such works by Jan Tomasz Gross and later on by Jan Grabowski, and in response to Ukrainian glorification of the OUN UPA, the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists and the Ukrainian Insurgent Army. Indeed, in April 2015, 3 years earlier, Ukraine adopted the so-called decommunization package, which included the, quote, law on the legal status and honoring the memory of fighters for Ukraine's independence in the 20th century, precisely those associated with what Poland perceives as genocide in Volhynia and Galicia in 1943-44. The Ukrainian law states that, quote, public denial of the legitimacy of the struggle for Ukraine's independence in the 20th century is deemed desecration of the memory of fighters for Ukraine's independence in the 20th century, denigration of the dignity of the Ukrainian people, and is unlawful. No wonder that already in July 2016, the Polish parliament adopted a resolution which specifically described the massacres in Volhynia as a genocide. There is therefore a bond of blood, of victimization and perpetration of violence between Poles, Ukrainians, and Jews, just as much as a history of centuries-long coexistence and mutual cultural exchange. There is a bond of memory and vengeance, of commemoration and erasure. But while the Poles and Ukrainians remain on either side of their mutual border, the case of the Jewish state is different. For even as Israel is committed to the memory of the Holocaust, it is also founded on a tale of heroism and erasure that both links it to Poland and Ukraine and at the same time contains its own regional narrative of glorification and forgetting. Here I would like to refer to the Israeli mechanism of repression of the Nakba, the expulsion of the Palestinians in 1948. The state of Israel was built around the notion of never again, and we shall never forget. And the process of its very making, the war in which the vast majority of the Palestinian population was expelled, was legitimized by these very slogans. Only by creating an independent majority Jewish state would another Holocaust be prevented, and any objections to the manner in which this goal was achieved would be pushed aside by the overwhelming memory, never to be forgotten, of the genocide of the Jews. From this perspective, the infamous recent Nakba law, that's the sort of code name for it, should come as no surprise. In a sense, it merely attempts to legislate a long-term convention in Jewish-Israeli public discourse, namely that the state celebrates its war of independence in 1948, and that any talk about those who paid the price for this accomplishment is at best irrelevant and at worst seditious. This 2011 law states that any institution funded or supported by the state could be deprived of its funding if it was engaged inter alia in, quote, commemorating Independence Day or the day of the establishment of the state as a day of mourning, end of quote. An appeal by the Association for Civil Rights in Israel and Adalah, the Legal Center for Arab Minority Rights in Israel, to the Israeli Supreme Court, argued that, quote, the law causes unprecedented harm to historical memory by using the power of the majority in order to try and erase and repress minority narratives about events, facts, emotions, and ideologies, and seeks to suppress essential ideological disputes that concern the fundamental questions of Israeli society, end of quote. But in 2012, the Supreme Court, the Israeli Supreme Court, turned down the appeal as, quote, not mature for a legal debate, basically that it had not really come up in any other court. In fact, the court showed no interest in this debate and implicitly accepted the state's right to impose its own, and generally the Jewish majority's, view of the past. So let me conclude with a few points here. A nation built on a cult of resurrection and memory could not possibly allow the summoning of the memory of its own birth in sin, to remember and to forget. Perhaps no other nation has internalized that lesson more powerfully. In Israel, laws trying to suppress the memory of the Nakba are the dark side of legislating Holocaust remembrance. As long as denial of the Nakba remains at the core of Israeli identity, no law will be able to liberate the state and its people from their own false memories and premonitions of catastrophe, or allow them to contemplate the possibility of coexistence with their Palestinian neighbors. From this perspective, the Polish-Ukrainian-Israeli triangle can both be broken down into its constitutive parts and be reprioritized. Poland and Ukraine's relationship to the Holocaust and ethnic cleansing in World War II is about confronting the past. It matters, of course, for nations to be able to look back to the darker episodes of their history clear-eyed and critically, so as to build a better, more open, and more just society in the present. And we all always refer to the example of Germany. But ultimately, the borders between Poland and Ukraine are unlikely to be disputed. Disagreements about the past are unlikely to cause major conflict, and the minorities that were at the core of these past horrors have been either murdered or expelled. But in the battles of memory, Israel is in a very different spot vis-a-vis the Palestinians. Here, the conflict is far from over, the borders have not been determined, and the populations are mixed as never before. Here, memory rises from the recesses of the past, fully armed, populating the battlefield of the present as a concrete, lethal presence. One can try to ignore it, avert one's eyes, deny its existence or veracity, yet it will be disarmed not by erasure, but only through recognition and acceptance. Thank you.
Thank you, Omer, and thank you for staying within the time, actually, as well within the time. Our next speaker is Professor Dalia Ofer, who is Max and Rita Haber Professor of Holocaust and East European Studies at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. She received the Ben-Zvi Award for her book, Escaping the Holocaust, Illegal Immigration to the Land of Israel, and the Jewish Book Award for the English version of that book. Her other books include Women in the Holocaust, which she authored with Nora Weitzman, and Her Story, My Story, Writing About Women in the Holocaust with Judy Baumel. In 2018, she received the Distinguished Achievement Award in Holocaust Studies from the Holocaust Education Foundation of Northwestern University. And the title of her talk today is History and Memory, a Challenge for Israeli Historians, a Personal Account. So, Dalia. Dalia, you seem to be muted.
Now it's okay. You hear me. I'm sorry. I apologize. I said thank you, and I should thank Monica for initiating this session and convincing me to participate, and I'm very glad that I've done it. And in a way, I'm thinking that we are sitting here 3 generations of historians, that I'm the veteran among you, and my talk that in many ways relates to what Omer said about Israel, but in a different perspective, I think will also demonstrate the fact that we are in a different generation of historians, although our opinions, I think, are not very different. So I will start now. As an historian, I focus my research on the Holocaust, including its memory in Israel and the role of survivors in shaping this memory and Israeli society at large. Memory and history not only differ, they also contrast. However, historians notice the impact of memory on writing the history and must be aware of its dangers. My presentation will draw the line between the Holocaust and the 1948 war, the War of Independence for Israel, for the Israeli, and the Nakba for the Palestinians. The two traumatic events are dominant in the uneasiness of the public discourse. Each group has its own collective memory and narrative that impacts the agenda of both the respective societies and the individuals that are comprised. Established in the wake of Second World War and the anti-colonial movement, the debate in Israel about the pre-statehood past and the aftermath of state establishment are fraught. Holocaust memories, literature, and research often appear in mass communication in Israel and have a powerful impact on public opinion and discourse. Since the 1990s, the debate over the 48 war have offered a revised narrative and conflict with the hegemonic Zionist one. Thus, the crux of my discussion is a connection between the Holocaust, the Jewish rebirth, and the Nakba, the word used by Arab Palestinians to describe the disaster of 1948. Since I included the word's personal account in my title of this lecture, I will combine my personal experience growing up in Palestine, Israel during these years, remembering the British mandate and the establishment of the State of Israel as an 8-year-old. Born and raised in Jerusalem, I experienced life in a city mixed of Palestinians, ultra-religious, traditional, and non-religious Jews. My home, although not very political or ideological, was still devoted to the new state and cherished Jewish independence. I was not raised to admire the working class political leadership that owned the hegemony at the time. Neither, however, was I trained to admire its opponents. Nevertheless, I attended an elementary school of the Zionist labor movement and was influenced by socialist values. My memories of the War of Independence, or 48, connect with the 4-week siege of Jerusalem, the shelling of our neighborhood, and the family evacuated from Atarot, a village near Jerusalem that found shelter in our home. When it all ended, Jerusalem was a different city, with internal borders and a wall of sorts down in the middle. I do not mean the wall of the old city, the wall kind of a wall in the what we call the Western city or the Jewish city. I do not remember being concerned about the different routine of city life on Saturdays, no more the walks to the old city and visits to a Palestinian contractor whom my father, a wall painter, worked with, or missing his 2 daughters whom I had often met and we played together. From then on, I grew up with no Palestinian acquaintances. The new people and kids we met were new immigrants, survivors of the Holocaust, and Jews from Islamic countries. My first encounter with a young Palestinian that I recall was in the early 1950s on a bus to Kibbutz Ha'on on the Lake of Galilee for a month of working in a kibbutz, which was part of the youth movement training. I sat next to him and we had a friendly conversation. He got off the bus in Nazareth, leaving me to wonder how didn't I realize that he was an Arab, but nothing more. We didn't call them Palestinian at the time, but Arab, this was the general word. I use Palestinians now all the time. Only after the 6-day war, when we in Jerusalem met Palestinians on a daily basis, I did recall the conversation with him. Israel changed after 1967. The territories became areas of interest, and the Palestinian question was no longer a problem vis-a-vis the Arab countries, but an internal issue of daily life. As a student of history and a teacher of history in high school, I realized that the question of Palestinian nationhood had become a major issue. One incident that I remember from my days as a teacher in the high school concerning Palestinian nationhood and the Holocaust, I will mention now. I should stress that the Holocaust was not taught in Israel high school at the time, only from the 1980s. As a master's student in Holocaust, specializing in Holocaust studies, I initiated a study unit on the Holocaust to be taught before the Holocaust Memorial Day. In 1969, I obtained a pre-publication manuscript version of Yoshua Porat's book, The Emergence of the Palestinian National Movement, which was a revolutionary book and really revised the history. When I taught the events in Palestine in 1936-39, I wrote on the board the Arab Revolt, 1936-39, while the official textbook called it the Arab Riots. It happened that the Education Committee of the Israeli Parliament visited our school in this very day. I was asked to host the committee in our history class. They entered the room with the words that I had written on the board still there and listened to the discussion. At the end of the day, I was invited to a concluding meeting with the committee members who had visited a number of classes. After a few introductory words, questions were allowed. Geula Cohen, that Omer knows the name and probably many others, a member of the right-wing party, asked me to explain the terminology I was using in class. I referred to Porat's new research and explained. She opposed the expression Palestinian National Movement and was outraged about it. After explaining her disappointment, she asked me cynically, "Are you teaching the Holocaust to your students?" I answered in the affirmative, explaining how I went about it, though it was not compulsory in the school, and asked, "What is the connection? Why did you ask about the Holocaust?" Now I will move to the 1980s and 1990s after the publication of documents translated from Arabic by the Truman Institute of the Hebrew University and new research on 1948 war, Benny Morris, The Birth of the Palestinian Refugee Problem, 47-49, Ilan Pappes, The Making of the Arab-Israel Conflict, and many others. They conveyed new findings and interpretation founded on the new archival documentation about the events and outcome of the war, difficult issues relating to flight and expulsions of Palestinians, and the army initiative, looting and mass killing by Israeli soldiers, and the destruction of Palestinians' homes and villages. A new concept was introduced into the Israeli discourse at that time, the Nakba. Harab had been using this term since 1948 to describe the catastrophe that had befallen on the Palestinians. The theft of their land, the destruction of their villages and homes, the deportation of over 700,000 people who became refugees in neighboring countries, and Israel's refusal to let them come in. The Arabs stressed that international support for Jewish statehood originated in guilt feeling about the Holocaust and enhanced Jewish support for Zionism. This made Palestinians the victims of victims, and the international community was too deaf to listen to them. Israelis understood these claims as condemnation of the moral justice of the established state of the state. Omer talked about it, I am not elaborating about this. The official Israeli narrative found them totally unacceptable, placing the burden of refugee problem on the Arab state. This state, after all, had rejected the UN partition resolution and encouraged the Palestinians to live until the Jews could be defeated and removed from the country. The proponents of this interpretation strengthened it by noting the support of Haj Amin al-Husseini, the Palestinian leader for Nazi Germany, and his cooperation with Hitler. Thus, the connection between the then recent events World War II and the 1948 war stress the clashing narratives of the different tragedies. The memory of the Holocaust has become a major factor in Israeli identity. Since the 1980s, it has been a compulsory subject in the high school curriculum. An important literary and biographical corpus of Holocaust evolved and was widely read. The Holocaust figures meaningfully in the performing arts, music, and exhibition. Since the late 1990s, the contribution of Holocaust survivors to the War of Independence has been widely researched, and their significant role in Israeli armed forces and the economy had been strongly acknowledged. The Nakba, in contrast, was treated to the work of forgetfulness. Israel did not want to remember. Research on the 1948 war by Palestinian historians and the refugee question went on anyhow. New voices of Israeli Palestinians grew in importance and then in centrality. The connection between the Holocaust and the Nakba received a new turn. On the one hand, the interpretation of Zionist project as a colonial one rather than an endeavor of a national movement became more popular following the 1997 war and the settlement enterprises in the West Bank. On the other hand, many Israeli Palestinian historians and researchers acknowledge the difference between the Holocaust, which aimed for the total annihilation of European Jewry, and the Palestinian refugees who were deported to the neighboring countries, mostly to the West Bank, then part of Jordan. Among those in Israeli peace movement, a loud call emerged to start a process of recognizing the evil of the past in order to set a reconciliation process in motion. However, the attitude of many Israelis still moves among resentment, hesitations, and readiness to accept responsibilities. This is demonstrated in various Israeli publications on the Nakba, the Holocaust, and the law about the Nakba that I didn't elaborate. Omer talked about it. The findings show that the majority is not ready to internalize the Nakba and its consequences. Even those who are ready to agree that the Nakba did happen, including deportation, unjustified killing, looting, and more, contend that it was a result of war, and such ugliness happens in wars. They admit that it was bad, but hold the Palestinians and the Arab countries responsible for it. After all, they had rejected the partition resolution and waged a war of annihilation against the Jewish population in the country. Going back to the personal. As a responsible historian and teacher in the university, I had to confront these issues. Together with a colleague, Dr. Adel Mana, we decided to offer a graduate seminar, History, Memory, and Education, centering on 1948 war and the Holocaust. We aimed it as a mixed class of Jewish and Palestinian Israeli students who majored in contemporary Jewry, Mid-Eastern studies, and education. We offered the seminar for 2 years until I retired and had more Israeli Palestinians in the second year. The energy and atmosphere of the seminars were evident, as equal voice was given to the different narratives that were presented in research papers on the topics, such as the war in the area of Negba and Nitzanim, which alluded to heroism and defeatism in the Negev campaign, the deportation of Palestinians from Jaffa and Ashkelon, and too many other cases to elaborate upon here. Dr. Mana and Dr. Moti Golani wrote a textbook that presented the two narratives side by side in order to encourage a fruitful and sophisticated discussion. To conclude, on September 17, 2021, as I was writing this account, in the newspaper Haaretz was published an article titled "The Matriculation, the exams of ending the high school in Israel, which are very, very important for entering the university, is gradually challenging the Israeli narrative of the Nakba. This was the title of the article. The writer quoted two short pieces of documents from the history exam. One from a Palestinian newspaper in Jaffa that called Palestinians who had fled to Arab countries a fifth column, and an important Israeli military commander, Yigal Allon, who gave an order to cleanse the Upper Galilee of Palestinians because the partition resolution assigned this territory to the Jewish state and the presence of Palestinians might destroy it. The students were asked to analyze each document, explain its motivation, compare them, and draw conclusions about the way they appear in connection to what they studied in class. It is an example, I think. I was very happy to read it, I must admit, as a teacher myself many years ago in the high school, and as the head of the history committee of the Ministry of Education many years ago. It is an example of a question that demands understanding and the ability to think critically. The fact that it appears in an official state examination is meaningful. As soon as a high school student study history while reading conflicting primary documentation and their teacher leads them to understand the complicated nature of historical interpretation, they will create a dialogue with the past, examining the collective memories and the contrasting narratives. I cannot be so naive as to think that the impacts of politics and that governs public sphere will disappear. However, critical thinking is the only hope for us researchers and educators. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that really, really thoughtful talk. Really appreciate hearing it, and I'll comment on it a little bit more at the end. I will note, I don't see anything in the chat. I don't know if people have put any comments yet. Do you guys see anything in the chat at this point, or is it something? Not yet. Okay, that's fine. Just wanted to make sure I had it working properly. Our third speaker is Professor Monica Rice, who is assistant professor and Robert Weiner and Ilan Peleg Scholar in Jewish Studies at Lafayette College. She's a former director of the Holocaust and Genocide Studies program at Gratz College. A native of Poland, she earned her BA and MA in Cultural Anthropology from Adam Mickiewicz University in Poznan, and a PhD in Judaic Studies from Brandeis University. She teaches on the Holocaust, Jewish humor, Jewish studies, Jewish-Christian relations, and Jewish culture. And Professor Rice's first book, What's Still Alive? Jewish Survivors in Poland and Israel Remember Homecoming, was a Choice Outstanding academic title. And the topic of her talk today is what went wrong after Neighbors, and can we still talk to one another? Monica.
Thank you very much, Jeff. I would like to thank the Polin Museum and also Krzysztof Persak for accepting our panel. And especially, I'm very grateful to Daria Offer and Omer Bartov for joining me for this panel. I appreciate it. Thank you. So my presentation addresses, partly similarly to Omer's presentation, the recent turmoil occasioned by political interventions in the activity of Polish historians who work to uncover aspects of Polish Jewish history that challenges the foundations of a self-congratulatory Polish identity. I will first briefly discuss an illusion that Poles ought naturally to assimilate shameful elements of the wartime and post-war past with respect to the Jews. I will then outline how serious the situation of anti-Semitism in Poland has become during the debate around the IPN amendment, after which I will consider what tools we might apply from the social sciences to lessen the knowledge gap between professional historians and the wider public about Polish behavior during the Holocaust. I want to begin by challenging the expectation that the societal transition from communism to democracy should be smooth and straightforward. In an essay analyzing this transition in Poland, the sociologist, political scientist, and diplomat Bronisław Mysztal has described two myths accompanying the process. The first is that, quote, Poland is now part of the West without actually having to undergo the process of Westernization. Were any such a statement true, Mysztal explains, one would have to accept that there were social forces capable of virtually moving the political mountains of impossibility, adversity, backwardness, and Kafkaesque surreality, and transporting them into fertile cultural fields of modernity, end quote. One would also need to assume that such forces grew organically from the so-called indigenous historical capital, and that they were thus potentially present in Polish society. The second myth assumes a sequential history of events, beginning, developing, and ending at certain times, and thus implying a clean break with the past. According to this line of thought, communist Poland was an endless stream of shameful totalitarian events which eventually came to an end and should cease to exist in the collective memory of the new Poles so that they can start anew without actually being bothered with the inglorious past. This was also a quote, end quote. None of these are accurate interpretations of the way a society works. Deep sociological and cultural processes often remain unobserved and uninterpreted by a majority of society, even while they influence the actions and self-perceptions of those members unconsciously. In this regard, I posit that the most significant of these hidden events in contemporary Polish history has been the disappearance of the murdered Jewish community and the various roles that Poles played in this event as witnesses, perpetrators, and fellow victims. Indeed, I would juxtapose this statement with Dalia Offor's claim about the centrality of the Holocaust in Israeli collective memory. In Poland, the Holocaust seems to occupy the same central position as in Israel, but inverted by obsessive attempts to repress and reject it. Here, Mysztal offers a compelling critique of a Westernization hypothesis that assumes that for Poland to achieve the same economic and political results as Western Europe, it needs to undergo processes similar to those that resulted in the full absorption of peasants and workers into the beneficiary stage of market capitalism. Because of evolutionary delays, so to speak, in transforming these two groups into a liberal middle class in Eastern Europe, however, different processes are needed for Poland in order to become a Western democracy. Additionally, these processes might be affected by structural elements of the political legal system or by economic circumstances that favor former communist actors developing a free market economy. Although Mysztal primarily refers to economic circumstances, to economic transformation, I will seek to apply his observations to an understanding of the cultural processes that accompany the assimilation of difficult historical truth. The question of how Poland and Eastern Europe more broadly might have responded to challenges of the reconstructed national identities has been a burgeoning subject for research. In the important volume entitled Bringing the Dark Past to Light, The Reception of the Holocaust in Post-Communist Europe, published in 2013, Joanna Michlitz and John Paul Himka expressed an optimism about Polish society as undergoing a second phase of restored memory, which they characterized as, quote, the increasing awareness that national history is more complex than a black and white vision opposing the communist version of the past, end quote. At the time, this diagnosis seemed like the accurate conclusion of a successful process of coming to terms with Poland's dark past. And so it was accepted by prominent historians of Polish-Jewish relations, including, for example, Antoni Poloński. Nobody was yet expecting what would transpire during the debate over the infamous IPN amendment proposed in January 2018 and misrepresented as the law that prosecuted the expression Polish concentration camps. What happened during that acrimonious debate, which resulted in, as somebody described it, the biggest diplomatic crisis in Poland's recent history, signaled public acceptance of the most crude anti-Semitic expressions, resembling to some degree the propaganda accompanying the anti-Zionist campaign of 1968. An opinion poll from around the time, conducted in June 2018, confirms the extent of social attachment to mythic conceptions of Polish history. In that survey, Poles were asked to list the most successful moments from the last 100 years of Polish history, as well as the greatest failures of the country. Rather expectedly, Poles indicated the regaining of independence itself, was 40%, as the greatest victory, followed by overcoming communism and accession to the EU. This was 19% and 18% respectively. As far as failures, it is significant that twice as many respondents to the survey could not mention any failures as those who could not mention any successes. This was 34% versus 17%. That indicates that 1/3 of the respondents were unwilling or unable to acknowledge any letdowns in Polish history in the last century. Among the mentioned failures were World War II and the German occupation. This was 14% respondents, communism, 9%, and the return of the law and justice regime in 2015. It was also 9%. Only 0.1% of survey respondents mentioned relations with Jews, including anti-Semitism, the anti-Zionist campaign of '68, or the Jedwabne massacre, as a Polish failure. This self-critique was as rarely mentioned as events such as the tragic death of General Władysław Sikorski in 1943, the rule of Władysław Gomułka, the surfeit of monuments dedicated to the 2010 Smolensk plane crash, or the breakdown of the Solidarity movement, events that not only did not challenge a positive Polish self-perception, but were manifestations of Polish victimization. Polish society does not easily accept responsibility for persecuting its Jewish ethnic minority, and in that respect, it's not very different from other societies that deal with difficult pasts. There's no national or state immunity from attempts at distorting and appropriating Holocaust memory. Myths, as Omer Bartow emphasizes, are equally prevalent on the other side of the former Iron Curtain. By their physical distance from the place of extermination, they just do not appear as onerous and provocative as those pervading the Holocaust memory in Eastern Europe. Nevertheless, considering how much research, educational, and commemorative initiatives have been created since Jan Gross's Neighbors to raise Poles' understanding of the tragedy that befell Polish Jews, the gap between the knowledge of the professionals and the awareness of the masses can be characterized as abysmal. An element of context to understand this disparity in the absorption of the dark past of national history lies in its demography. Already in 1966, no less a thinker than Theodor Adorno had speculated, following an observation by Eugene Kogon, that the concentration camp guards were often, if not most usually, the sons of farmers. He envisioned as one of the goals of education, and of Holocaust education in particular, a debarbarization of the countryside, even though it might seem to offend people born in rural areas. That supposition appears to hold true for Polish society as well, especially if we recall Misztal's conclusion that the Polish nation has not gone through the process of the transformation of its peasant and working classes into a liberal democratic middle class. While violence by ethnic Poles against Jews took place everywhere in occupied Poland, it was especially in the countryside, as recent Polish studies have confirmed, that Jews in hiding encounter a most brutal end at the hand of peasants, including the very individuals who were sheltering them, or even larger groups, such as at Jedwabne. Although distortions of Holocaust history may be prevalent, there is still much to be learned from societies that exhibit a wider assimilation of such a difficult past. One such instructive example is that of Germany, as also Omer mentioned, as a very good kind of paradigmatic model for us. Although one should preface this comparison with the disclaimer that I'm not suggesting, obviously, relativizing Germany's ultimate responsibility for the organization and execution of the final solution. Bernhard Giessen, a prominent sociologist recently deceased, provides a compelling case for a universalizing view that applies also to bystanders when he writes, quote, "Nations that cannot look back to a long political history as states, or that cannot ignore the discontinuities in their history, face special problems in constructing memories to support their identity. The emptiness or the evil of the recent history fosters an escape to a timeless mythical past in which culture and nature are merged and blended in harmony. Looking back to the primordial paradise fuels energies to overcome decadence and disease, artificiality and pollution in present societies, or it provides a claim on a homeland that's bringing the community back to its natural roots, end quote. Applying this analysis to Poles, Polish identity seems always to have been steeped in a myth of innocent sacrifice. Recent political entrenchment against a more critical approach to Polish history has intensified the language of defense against alleged attack on this primordial innocence. Giesen further differentiates two ways of coping with the trauma of Nazi perpetrators. An older generation, which experienced Weimar, possessed as a frame of reference a pre-Nazi worldview, and the shame of their defeat was that they knew. For those raised on Nazis or the Hitlerjugend generation, in contrast, the dominant feeling was one of shame that they were not formed to feel. It was a shock of betrayal. Both forms of shame manifested in silence. Drawing an analogy with Polish society, most members of a cultural elite or intelligentsia denied any significant collaboration of Poles with Nazis, as in Jedwabne, or even that there was a broad approval of their policies. They instead created a counter-narrative of universal opposition to Nazi anti-Jewish persecutions and of broad societal efforts to rescue Jews. This group reacted to the revelation of Jedwabne similarly to the Hitlerjugend generation, with a surprised, what on earth happened? Why did nobody tell us? The actual Polish perpetrators of anti-Jewish violence were able to remain silent, protected by this denial of the intelligentsia. Giesen reports that the creation of rituals of confession was a transformative process for Germany's approach to the Holocaust. Originating in Judeo-Christian theology of atonement, such rituals may facilitate a greater societal acceptance of moral responsibility for a nation's past guilt, to the extent that they may inculpate a population of silent witnesses who had done nothing to prevent a crime. They may therefore be performed by otherwise innocent individuals who are able to admit to symbolic communal guilt. The first such ritual that changed the narrative of German guilt took the form of Chancellor Willy Brandt kneeling in front of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising Monument during his visit to Warsaw in 1970. This action, which seemed more authentic and redeeming to the extent that it also appeared unplanned, conveyed that the German guilt was no longer relativized, or as he said, as Giesen emphasized, relativized by reference to the sufferings of the Germans or to a fatal blindness and seduction, end quote. Similar in its effect might be Polish President Kwaśniewski moving an apology on the 60th anniversary of the Jedwabne massacre. As public confessions of guilt became means of constructing a new collective identity, a wave of them spread across Western Europe from the leaders of France, Italy, Norway, the Netherlands, and the Vatican, just to name a few. The most authentic rituals of atonement, however, need to occur spontaneously as a fruit of conscience of so-called average citizens, not as official acts of remembrance. Jerzy Jedlicki, a prominent Polish historian and anti-communist activist, has drawn attention to small actions of the commemoration of Jewish presence and to expressions of sincere wonder and sorrow about the disappearance of Polish Jews as representing true social change, even while they may concern only an elite of sensitive individuals and therefore seem to have only a limited effect on a wider population. In this context, one could mention as examples Rafał Betlejewski, who created the action I Miss You Jew, Darek Pobiela's action People Not Numbers, and the activism and journalism of Katarzyna Markusz. But there are others, countless and mostly unrecognized individuals who take care of local Jewish cemeteries, synagogues, and shuls, so as to keep the memory of an erased Jewish community alive. They are often singular beacons of humanity in a world that seems intentionally not to remember, so as more comfortably to neglect its moral duty to commemorate the murdered Polish Jews. Nevertheless, this process is not a smooth upward progress. Giesen acknowledges that, quote, although spreading rapidly in Western democracies, these revisions are rarely accepted unanimously by all participants in public discourse. The wide public acceptance of a new ritual of remembrance may even evoke a counteracting revisionist attack on the new orthodoxy, end quote. This formulation accurately describes Polish government-sponsored attacks on historians, such as a court case against Barbara Engelking and Jan Grabowski, a legal complaint against journalist Katarzyna Markusz, and the multiple attempts to prosecute Jan Gross for his published claims. The Law and Justice government cultivates Poland's status as history's whipping boy, introducing a series of new martyrs to minimize any threat from the research that steadily debunks such sacred status. These new martyrs include the doomed soldiers, for example, who were members of the anti-communist Polish resistance movement active at the end of World War II and its aftermath, as well as Jewish rescuers who were allegedly not given enough recognition by a world obsessed with blaming the Holocaust on Poles. Admittedly, the time of transformation is not naturally conducive to critical self-examination. Sociologist Sławomir Kapralski draws attention to the fact that it is usually only a tiny fraction of a society that advances its critical memory. Quote, he says, for the remaining part, threatened in their ontological security, memories serve as trenchers and myths as a protection, end quote. Some of the resistance to accept a difficult past might be explained by so-called culture wars, as understood by Terry Eagleton. In other words, significant ideological pressures can make it harder for Poles to regard themselves critically. As an example, the outspoken activism of LGBTQ groups radically challenged the conservative understanding of social and sexual mores. Although Poles had not been uniformly conformed to Catholic teachings on questions like marriage, premarital abstinence, and abortion, Polish acceptance of heteronormativity was universal. Before his recent demise, the Polish cultural anthropologist Wojciech Burszta reported that homosexual relations, for example, were accepted only as something anomalous. When they were proposed to be affirmed on equal terms, strong resistance followed. It remains to be seen how much this particular ideological challenge may take root in a largely traditional Polish society, and whether an association of pro-LGBTQ actions, for example, with calls for sensitivity towards immigrants and a more critical self-assessment of Polish behavior toward the Jews, may lead to the formation of opposing cultural blocs, each even more entrenched in its own vision. In conclusion, then, my presentation has dealt with political challenges to the historical research that tends to undermine a self-glorifying Polish identity. I have questioned the presumption that a society undergoing a transition from communism to democracy, especially one as experienced during World War II as Poland, can achieve a more self-critical understanding of its history without suffering at least some major setbacks. Pointing out a recent tendency to reversion to a more nationalistic vision of Polish history, I have suggested that the most effective way of transforming Polish society toward a greater understanding of its troubled past may consist in a change of hearts that may happen, on the one hand, organically, through the actions of individuals moved to express repentance and regret, and two, by investigating what kind of dissemination of the accumulated knowledge about Polish-Jewish relations could be most effective in bridging the gap between the experts and the broader public. One question that remains for further research might be how recent global changes in social and sexual mores affect the ways in which Polish society defines itself, and to what extent these social changes may provide a stabilizing or destabilizing factor for the reconstruction of national identity and for a deeper Polish understanding of Polish history. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Monica, and thank you to all three of the panelists and to the audience for being here. So I have some comments. Do you all hear me okay? Yeah, you hear me okay? Okay. So I have some comments that I have just made notes of that I'll talk about first, and then I'll go to the comments in the chat that I see is now filling up. So first of all, I want to say these three papers really worked well together, and share a lot in common in the concern that we have with historians of societies in turmoil, that there really is something going on in the world today, in all of the countries that you are looking at, in Poland, Ukraine, in Israel, in which history is being contested in ways that I don't think it has been before, and contested not only by historians, by professional historians, but contested by the state, by the government, and contested by ordinary people, by the public. And this is again taking place around the globe. In addition to the 3 countries that you looked at, I can think of my own native Canada right now, which is having huge debates over the Canadian treatment of the First Nations and the histories of residential schools. I can think of Australia and debates taking place there over the Aboriginal population, South Africa over apartheid, and really most prominently here in the United States, where we are having similar memory laws being put into place. Well, it's not criminalization, but we're having laws banning the teaching of the 1619 Project, laws banning the teaching of slavery as an important component in the formation of the United States. We're having huge battles over the Confederacy and over the Civil War, over the meaning of the 1960s. So the phenomena that you're talking about seem to be universal. And one of the questions I have for all 3 of you is how specific you think they are to the regions that you're looking at. Monica threw in the point about post-communist adjustment, and certainly that's a component. I'd be curious to hear, what are some of the other uniquenesses and how these examples are different than, really anywhere else in the world. I also think about why this is happening now, and there's obviously a lot of reasons, some of which the 3 of you have touched upon. I would add just the way that the public is getting their history right now, which is predominantly through Twitter, through Facebook, through social media, and more from historians. But also, they can get diluted versions of what historians are saying through Twitter and Facebook. I'm sure we have all seen this. We've all seen our writings, condensed or distorted into some caricature of what they are and spread on Twitter and Facebook. And then the public also has the ability to comment, to intimidate us, to harass us, and to do so in all types of ways through social media, as well as occasionally through the courts. And we certainly know of examples in Poland where that's occurred recently. I think there's probably going to be more examples of this type of intimidation through the courts that these memory laws have brought into place. So another issue so that's one issue that I want to bring up about is the public interest in history. And I think actually in some ways that's a good thing, that the public is interested in history, finally. People are, listening to people are trying to hear what we're saying, hearing it in their own way. But there is widespread public interest in history in a way that I don't think there has been before. And that's, that in itself is interesting. So another point that I want to talk about is that both Omer and Dalia dealt with is the comparison between the Nakba and the Holocaust. Obviously, they're very different events, and any comparison is going to, there's going to be a lot of differences. When people say that you can't compare 2 events, I always say, well, of course you can compare them. You just point out that there are differences. To compare isn't to equate. And I know that that's what both of you are doing, is comparing rather than equating. But I will say that I think that where they really are most similar is in the memory of them, and in both in the ways that the states in which they occurred are denying both of the events. And that's interesting and gets us to the cultural wars and to the cultural memory wars that we were just talking about. They also are connected, the Holocaust and the Nakba, in interesting ways, and that the Nakba probably would not have happened if not for the Holocaust, which in a way should make the Palestinian narrative be even more concerned, disturbed by the Holocaust, because it is the Holocaust that indirectly displaced them as well. So that's, that could be an interesting direction to take it, is to look at the commonalities, look at how the Holocaust harmed not only the Jews, but also harmed the Palestinians in this indirect way. So there are certainly similarities in the memory of those of those events. And even without outright denial, both groups display enormous obfuscation. And I really like that term, obfuscation. One of you used it in your papers, and I know it's a term that David Katz uses a lot to talk about Eastern Europe, and particularly Lithuanian Holocaust obfuscation. I think that's a great term, because it's not really what we mostly hear. It's not total denial, but obfuscation, the argument that I can't remember which one of you said, that said, well, it was all war. I think it was Dahlia. It was all war. Terrible things happened during war. And this is one way in which the Holocaust is relativized in parts of Central and Eastern Europe by saying, well, it was all just part of war. I mentioned when I was introducing myself at the very beginning, I have a book on the pogroms of the Russian Civil War coming out. And I've heard similar arguments made about those pogroms, that, well, it was a civil war. So, of course, people were killed. They were just killed in the part of the pogrom. So this type of argument can take place for anything, for if we're talking about the Israeli War of Independence, or if we're talking about the Holocaust. Terrible things do happen in war. But really the question is, how come some countries have been able to come to terms with their past, whereas other countries struggle so much? And this, to me, is the key question. I don't know, to be honest, if some countries have come to terms with it, but a good example is Germany, which does seem to have come to terms in ways that other countries that were involved in the Holocaust have not. And to me, one of the answers, and you all mentioned a few answers of your own, but to me, I'll add that I think one of the answers is the completeness of the project. That after the Holocaust, there weren't large numbers of Jews, or proportionately large number of Jews, returning to Germany and reassuming positions of prominence, whereas there were in Poland and Ukraine. And even, certainly in the immediate aftermath of the war, there were in Poland and Ukraine, particularly in small towns where it was often Jews who still emerged as the local party bosses through the 1960s, 1970s. So the issues remained. They remained alive. And I think this is what Omer was talking about at the end of his paper, with the issue of the Palestinians is still alive. There's still, Israelis still regard the Palestinians as an existential threat. And so it's difficult to come to terms with the atrocities that were committed against them. The continued presence of the people who the genocide or the claims of genocide have been committed against are still in the public. And it gets to another point about the formation of the nation. It really is maybe related mostly to Omer's point, but to this comparison in general. There's the old saying about what is a nation. A nation is an imagined community that claims a common language, a shared territory, and its own genocide. And increasingly, that notion of a genocide is becoming more important for the formation of nations. That every nation seems to need to claim that it's founded on the basis of a genocide. And I recall being struck when I first started to go to Ukraine by the ease with which people referred, even non-Jews, referred to houses as a Jewish house. And they would, give me tours through small towns and say, these are beautiful old Jewish houses. And that struck me as an acknowledgement of the genocide that I wasn't getting in other ways. But the fact that they still see the presence of the Jews in these houses in which Christians are now living, but they still call them Jewish houses. And, I was amused by the notion that a house can have an ethnicity, right? What makes a house an ethnicity? And I was thinking, where else in the world do you talk about a house as having an ethnicity? And then, of course, the obvious example was Jerusalem, where constantly I have friends who live in beautiful Arab houses in various regions in Katamona and Talpiah, and talk about these beautiful Arab houses that they live in now. So similarly, the memory of the genocide is there, or the memory of, I don't want to say genocide, but the memory of it is there, what happened is there in the houses. So, I think that's in large part what memory laws are about, is trying to control that narrative. I do want to say, and I'll wrap up momentarily, but I do want to say that another thing that I find interesting is the distinction between memory laws that criminalize what historians do or that simply ban it. And I do think there's a crucial distinction between criminalizing and banning, which is one's to say that you're not allowed to teach critical race theory, for instance, in the United States. Several state legislatures have issued rules that you're not allowed to teach you're not allowed to teach critical race theory. But if you do, you're not going to be sent to prison. And that's a crucial difference. But I believe it's the Ukrainian law, the only one still on the books that speaks about loss of liberty as a sentence for violating memory laws, as opposed to being sued civilly, which is bad enough as it is. You shouldn't be able to be sued civilly either. You know, history should not be judged in the courtroom. But I do think that's an important distinction, is criminalization versus just that type of ban, versus controlling what happens in the classrooms. And then I'll just close on the question about where do we go from here? You know, what is the solution? And Monica proposed atonement and spoke about these rituals of atonement, which I agree, I think is very important. We need those, and maybe that's something that Germany has done well, something that South Africa is also striving to do, but I don't know how well they've done it. But I think that's the crucial question. How do we go from here? How do we, how do we harness the public enthusiasm for history that we're seeing right now and push it in the right direction and bring people together in a way of showing how we've all suffered under these regimes and how we've all suffered by the wars of the 20th century. And maybe, we don't need to be doing these comparative suffering, but we can figure out commonalities between our experiences and ways of moving forward. And perhaps that's the obligation of historians of our generation, is to figure out how to help people move forward, to recognize where all people have gone wrong, where all people have allowed violence to foster and have facilitated conflict. So I'll leave it on that and see if any of you want to respond to anything that I've said, and then we can go to the chat questions. So anybody want to respond? Omer, go ahead.
Yeah, there was so much there that in what you said and some of the comments from panelists, I just want to make some bullet points, some of the points you raised and some that I saw in the chat. One thing that you asked was, how specific are these examples? And I was trying to think of distinctions, and I think that one of the most important distinctions that came up in what Dalia and I were saying is that there are hot conflicts and cold conflicts. The Nakba is actually not over. That's what all Palestinians would tell you. So there's a difference, as I was saying, between, this a kind of rhetorical conflict between Poland and Ukraine, or even Israel and Poland, or Israel and Ukraine, and the fact that you have an ongoing event, right? So I think this is one important thing. The second, someone asked, and I thought it was an interesting question on shame. And what role does shame play in this? And can shame be expressed only in silence? And of course, silence is a big issue when we talk about genocide. And there are various, arguments that there was silence after the event. People couldn't talk about it, or people didn't want to hear about it. What I would say is that silence is never necessarily an expression of shame. And that shame in general is very hard to come by. After genocide or after ethnic cleansing or after any event of mass violence, certainly not among perpetrators. I've not found any among perpetrators who ever expressed any shame, let alone guilt, sort of legal guilt, but even just shame. And countries in general find it very hard to do that. And Germany, as I think Ilan Peleg was noting in one of the comments, Germany is a good example, but it's a very created a kind of new type of national identity. that facilitated that. And even then, it, for a very long time, and in many ways until today, it did not express national shame, but rather a sense of guilt about crimes that were carried out in its name. And the physiology of crimes committed in the name of the German people really shamed someone who did that, but it was not the German people. It was that entity that had done those crimes in the name of the Germans, and that was very shameful. And that brings, I don't want to keep talking, but I'll just mention two other issues. One is a very early note that was made by Polonsky here, that what we need is empathy. And I think that Monica is sort of alluding to that too, because that's, atonement. And I think, the problem with empathy is not empathy itself, but who do you feel empathy for? And when you speak about genocide, when you speak about such events, empathy often comes into play, but it's not necessarily empathy for those you want to see it applied to. It's a much more either very general attitude. You find that in Ukraine, for instance, that people speak about the Holocaust as a terrible thing, but they don't really want to talk about or write about the Holocaust in Ukraine. And it can be a kind of human empathy, but not necessarily empathy for those people who may be seen as threatening you. And that brings me to what you were saying on houses, and I'll finish here because houses is such an interesting example. And that does apply, of course, to Ukraine, to Poland, to all of Eastern Europe, and to Israel-Palestine. And yes, that people would point out and say, this is an Arab house, it's a beautiful house, and this is a Jewish house, the Jews had beautiful houses. But property has the other side, which is what is, I'd say, ubiquitous, and that is its property. And if you have a house and you know that it belonged to someone else, you certainly don't want to take any responsibility for what happened to that person in whose house you're now living, because you may lose your house. And so property really is very much part of denial. You may admire those houses, but now they're yours and they ought to remain yours, and you won't say anything that will put that in any kind of risk.
I think that's a great point about property and the holding of property. And so it's much more difficult to reconcile if that reconciliation means you may lose your house and means you'll actually have to give reparations of some type.
Yes, and I just say, look, property, genocide, and ethnic cleansing are about property. Ultimately, it is about taking people's land or people's houses and removing the people either upstairs or outside of your borders, and taking over their land and their property. And so in that sense, we have to think about it as a complete social transformation. And if you think about it in those terms, then to talk about shame, to talk about guilt, to talk about empathy is all very nice. But ultimately, what you need to do is and I would end here, is that a state, an organization, but here we are talking about states, has to accept responsibility for what happened formally. It has to do that. That's a first step, even though it cannot return all the property. And secondly, it has to pay up. And it has to pay up. Obviously, it cannot pay up for everything. That will never happen. But it has to do these two things. As long as it doesn't, and Germany, this is the one thing that Germany more or less did. That is, it did restitution, and it made a sort of official statement, not exactly of guilt, but of responsibility. Without that, talk is cheap, and only paying without accepting guilt is basically blood money. So you must have the two of them together.
Let me thank you. Let me give Dalia the opportunity to.
Yeah, I'll say shortly. I think that the last point of Omer is very right, and I think that many people in Israel try to work toward this because practically the country geographically is different than it was in 1948. It cannot go back from all points of view to the same situation, and the issue of returning of the refugees and how many refugees and how many will return, it's really an issue that has to be talked about, and Israel has to take some responsibility, others have to take responsibility. The way must be a practical way. However, there are some practical ways that we can do it. Looking at your first question, how can we go about? I mean, we cannot solve the problem of the politicians. I mean, I'm so old with all this, peace movement from the beginning of Shalom Achshav, Shalom and Bitachon, and my age, I can already testify to my activities always, and my husband even more than myself, and my children, and now my grandchildren. However, we are not close to it. Still, there are things that everybody can do. For example, there is an organization, Zochrot, remembers, people who go to the villages that were erased, but then put some stones and remember the place and tell about it. The knowledge is important. Or the mutual day of commemoration that we have before the Independence Day of Israel. And we have now, it started as a very small groups of Jews and Arabs who suffered terrorist attacks and lost their children, that started to do commemoration together. And now it really became quite a large movement, and it has its chain in the social, internet. And I think small things like this we can do, like teaching and working with children, working with students, and so on. So there are steps that we can do, but we are historians. I mean, we are not the politicians. And I cannot say that I'm optimistic, but I must admit that what I quoted from this article, the fact that a formal exam in history is talking about an Israeli officer who tells we have to cleanse the Upper Galilee, even if you say, okay, it is justified in the circumstances of this and this and that, this act has been acknowledged. I think it's a very important point.
Yeah, I agree. I think I agree completely with what you're saying, although, I would think maybe historians do have a bit of an obligation to shape the public debate, but I recognize how frustrating it is if they're not able to do that. Monica seems to have disappeared. I was just going to go to her, but is she there? So I will wait and see if she pops up again. In the meantime, there's a few questions that ask in some form whether it's possible to create a culture of empathy in a situation of hyper-nationalism. I'm looking at Joanna Michlik's question, Ilan Pelek's question. Antony Polonsky brings up the Catholic Church in Poland as well as another factor. So I think all of these questions are related to, is it possible to seek the type of reconciliation that we're talking about or that we would like to happen in cases where states are defining themselves on the basis of ethno-nationalism? Any thoughts?
Well, it's a good question, and there's not a good answer to it. I would say you raise this issue on why is this happening now? Why all these memory laws happening now? And I think there's it's in a sense. Oh, here's Monica. So I'll be quick. Yeah, sorry. So in a sense, I think. Part of it, it has to do with, as you said, social media. But I think we need to see that within a context, and in that context, we are living right now, despite Dalia's guarded optimism, in a pretty bad time of growing ethno and territorial nationalism, growing xenophobia, And that is feeding, I would say, this kind of insistence on one's own memories and on self-empathy, on empathizing with one's own victimhood, and on rejecting others and their claims of victimization. And it feeds into social media, but I wouldn't really say that it's the social media that's producing it. It's coming from a sort of wider and deeper context. And you see that in America, you see that in Europe, and not only in Eastern Europe, but also in Western Europe. And you see that in Israel. Yeah.
Monica. Yeah, let me stop you because Monica has reappeared. So we've only got about 4 minutes left. So I'll give Monica 4 minutes to respond to any of the questions in the chat or anything that I said. We've been talking about the possibility.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, yes, thank you. I'm sorry, I misunderstood. I thought that you would be asking specific questions, but I would like to add something also to what Omer said about the property and the recent law. There was a few questions also about the recent law and about empathy, because, yeah, talk is cheap, but the question is of those, obviously, empathy cannot be mandated and really, introduced and kind of taught to a society like math can, but it is something that people acquire, and they acquire it by exposure to realizing of the suffering of the other. That's one of the ways. And that's the whole question then of how we educate. So education has to obviously continue, and that's one of the thing, right, that the whole Center for Holocaust Research in Poland, for example, has to continue and do what they do in spite of being constantly attacked and harassed, also materially. But the empathy is really something that is a grassroots, it's a feeling of an individual who understands what actually happened. That will also, eventually, it will influence the perception of the laws that the country has, for example, about restitution. Law, obviously,
seem to have cut off.
Problem.
All right, well, while she's reloading, there's a lot of other good questions. We have about 3 minutes, so maybe I'll go to one of these. Scott Uri asks about, for all three panelists, should we be optimistic or pessimistic about the possibility of historical reconciliation in Poland, Ukraine, and Israel? Which I think we've talked about a little bit. I think we may have answered that, and unfortunately, it was not a particularly good answer. I think we all agree we were all somewhat pessimistic. Anna asks about the notion that the absence of successful 1990s transition of Polish countryside into a stronger middle class accounts for much of the recent difficulty with reckoning with Polish collaboration during the war. And then looking at late 19th century anti-Semitism of the middle class, anti-Jewish mob violence breaking out mainly in urban centers or French experiences during the war weakens the argument. I think a focus on culture addresses this issue implicitly, but I'd love to hear more. I don't know if anybody wants to respond to that in a minute or so. Anthony Polonsky asks about the restitution law. Geneviève here asks about the dual status of Poles and Ukrainians as perpetrators and victims. Anybody want to take up any of those that I quickly went through? And well, we have about a minute left, so maybe you want to give a final 30-second send-off. I'm sorry, Monica, we keep losing you.
Dalia.
Dalia?
No, I thought you are going to respond. As
no,
to
go ahead.
Well, as to the issue of Israel, I'm not very optimistic. Unfortunately, I wish I was more. At one point in my life, I have 4 daughters, and all of them married to families that the parents were of the right, and they all moved to the left. So I was very optimistic, but then the elections came, and the results were obvious. So I'm not very optimistic, and what happens in Israel is now really bad, and in the area in general. But I still think very strongly that to explain, to learn, to show the other side, not to give up about it. And as long as we will be able to continue with this, and the school systems will continue to teach in a good way, not all of them, of course, you know, there are different teachers, different schools and so on. As long as we have a group that is really confronting the issues, I think that we have a hope. And I think that many Israelis are tired from being all the time in wars, so.
Yes.
I don't know.
Yeah, thanks for those comments. I know we're at 2 o'clock, but I want to give Monica a chance to say something, even if it means we go a minute or so over, since you're back now. Do you have anything to add? Or you're frozen again?
I'm so sorry. No, I'm sorry. I guess I wanted to finish. I'm sorry. Discussing the
Go ahead,
recent,
finish. Take a minute.
Restitution law.
Something wrong.
Yeah, it doesn't sound like you're cut off. So I think we better end
Yes,
the
that
session
we. It was not affected. You hear me?
No.
You cannot hear me.
No.
I'm sorry.
We can hear you.
I'm so sorry.
We can hear you. I think we have to wrap up in any case.
Not precisely. Yes, I'm sorry.
We're over time. So I'm sorry that we weren't able to hear more from you, Monica, but at least your paper was really fantastic, really interesting. In fact, all three of them were, I found this to be a fascinating panel, so I appreciate having the discussion with you.
Wonderful.
And thank you all for coming, and thank you to
very
Pauline,
much.
and thank you to the organizers, and thank you to the audience, and thank you to everybody.
It's wonderful.
So with that,
Thank
see
you.
at the next
Thank you,
panel.
Dalia.